dovetails nicely into what we're going to be talking about today, which is conscription during the Napoleonic Wars. And just reading up on this, Graeme, it has been said that France was the first nation to introduce universal military conscription as a condition of citizenship. But conscription has been around for ages in Europe, correct?
Yeah, that's right. If we take conscription to mean just compulsory military service, then it's been around more or less since the dawn of time. If we look back at ancient civilizations, the duty to defend the community fell on every man. But even in societies that developed a separate professional military, like, for example, ancient Rome, there was still a reliance on aspects of compulsory service. And in kind of classical republican countries like Rome, like in ancient Greece, citizenship and military service are very much linked together. Now, this kind of compulsory service continues on through the Middle Ages, but by this stage we're getting towards things like compulsory levies, along with a military class, the knightly class, who were generally privileged, but they were meant to offer permanent military service. Or at least permanent obligation when military service was demanded. Levies, more or less ad hoc, were only called up for short-term campaigns. But if we fast forward to the 18th century, kind of, the precursor to what we're looking at today, armies are more permanent, they're larger, and they need to be manned. And various countries therefore bring in compulsory systems of service to get men into the military. Almost all countries retain a compulsory levy for their militia or the equivalent, the Landwehr, for example, in times of emergency. But some of these regular permanent forces are also increasingly manned by men kind of compelled to serve. So Prussia and Russia both had their version. Austria from the 1770s has a version of compulsory service. Normally these are just kind of regional based, so a region will be told, you've got to raise a regiment, and how they do it is up to them. But a form of compulsory service is in place in a number of states through the 18th century. So it's not entirely new that we get an idea of compulsory service. But as we'll speak about later, I think the way that France does it in the Revolution, and especially under Napoleon, is quite different to what comes before.
Well, let's kind of talk about the Royal Army in France before the Revolution. Consisted of a long service, regular volunteers, some aristocrats, primarily in the Navy and the cavalry, and then some foreign mercenaries. But like you mentioned, there's still conscription in local militias, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the pre-revolutionary milice, the militia in France, was selected by ballot from amongst everyone in their region. So the militia was a reserve force. It was only really meant to be called up and mobilized during times of war. And apart from that, you do a kind of a few weeks a year. And it was meant to be mobilized to take over reserve roles from the regular army. But militia service is really hated by the French peasantry before the revolution. It's one of the main complaints that comes out from rural Frenchmen in the Cahiers de Doléances. So the complaints that they're invited to make to the royal government before the revolution, or at the start of the revolution, and the complaint was partly about the fact of service. So men didn't like to be taken away from their families or their businesses or their farms, leaving their dependents without financial support. Some of it, though, was also about the pointlessness of it. Militia service is just for reservists. So there's less of a sense in militia service that you're kind of contributing to a wider national effort. So there really wasn't a huge amount of buy-in from men being called up. But absolutely, compulsory service was used in the militias before the revolution. Although I should point out that's not unusual. Britain, for example, had militia ballots throughout the revolutionary and Napoleonic period as well. Even at a time when it's one of the few countries that never puts conscription into the army, it still has compulsory militia ballots.
Yeah, I can see why it would be hated, especially in the rural communities where you need every hand you can get for farming and raising crops and all that. So, yeah, I could see why there was a resistance to it. What kind of happens then during the French Revolution that kind of kicks off this widespread conscription?
I guess at this stage it's probably worth quickly defining what we mean by conscription. So in a broader modern sense, the term conscription and compulsory service kind of mean the same thing. And this is compulsory service which can be imposed on whole populations on an ad hoc basis. But at the time, they had a slightly more refined understanding of it, and that's that conscription was a regular system of calling up named individuals. So the state doesn't just say something like, we want all 20-year-olds to serve, or we want all 20-year-olds in your province to serve. But they say, we have a list of all men, and we want this specific group to serve on these specific terms. And it's a regular thing, kind of happens each year. And the French Revolution moves from this kind of ad hoc, just call people up, to a much more regular system. But it doesn't do so immediately. What happens in the French Revolution to really change things is pretty much threefold. First of all, Frenchmen are suddenly reimagined as being citizens. So there's a classical Republican belief that I mentioned before, that defense of the nation was the responsibility of every male citizen. So that comes back to the fore, and the belief grows that all men owe military service to the state if it's threatened. So we've got this idea, men are citizens. It's your patriotic duty to the nation. If you don't defend it, who will? And the second thing that happens is that the French revolutionary state was threatened, and the threat eventually becomes pretty big. So in April 1792, and partly in an attempt to rally royalists and constitutional monarchists and radicals all around a single cause, France declares war on Austria. Now this is meant to be a short, sharp war just to kind of get the country together. But it pretty soon escalates into a much bigger conflict. Within a month, Prussia declares war on France. The war starts going really badly for France. The monarch is blamed. The monarchy is overthrown. Relations with the rest of Europe tank. And by early 1793, France is at war with half the continent. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, major powers surrounding France are at war with them. So fundamentally, they need manpower to fight this war. They're being invaded by most of the rest of Europe. And the third issue, very much linked to this, is that the regular army had significant problems, even as the war was breaking out. As the revolution hit, these noble officers of the army leave en masse. A lot of them emigrate or resign, or they just stop doing their jobs. Morale is really low, desertion rates are high. The rank and file are not particularly well motivated. They are professionals. They're not necessarily motivated by the same revolutionary fervor as volunteers might be. So overall, the regular army is not in a great state. Now, the regulars do continue to fight well in the war, and they do provide the backbone of the army as it kind of grows through the war years. But it's very clear that more men are needed. So with these three things, with the idea that all men are citizens and therefore should owe service, with the war going badly and with the regular army in trouble, the revolutionary government needs to do something, and they decide first of all to call on volunteers, which doesn't have a great uptake, and then in early 1793 they decide they need more men, so they call on an extraordinary levy of 300,000 men in early 1793. Now, for context, that would more than double the French army. That's a lot. And these are going to be citizen soldiers motivated by patriotism, and these men, with their extra motivation, are going to sweep aside the armies of old Europe, even with their lesser training, even with less equipment. Their patriotic fervour is meant to carry them forward. So the call goes out. Many areas respond really, really positively, but of course some didn't. And in the main, it's the royalist areas that really don't respond well to this call-up of 300,000 men, with the Vendée, especially in the west of France, basically breaking out into open revolt because of this call-up. So from about March of 1793, the revolutionary government's facing this external threat from all of these countries. They're now facing an internal rebellion, and they're still trying to call men up. Not as many men turned up as they wanted, so by the summer of 1793, with the situation deteriorating and with actually half the country now in revolt, because in May, the Parisian Revolution had taken a turn that the rest of the country didn't like, so a lot of towns and cities and departments rose in revolt against the Paris revolutionaries. Half the country is in revolt. The government in Paris says, okay, we need more men. We can't just have 300,000. So they issue what they call the levy en masse. Now, this is in the context, like I say, of external enemies. France is invaded from the Low Countries, from Italy, from Spain. They're threatened on the Rhine. They've got all these internal revolts. So, this is a last gasp for the revolutionary government. But the levy en masse, sometimes called conscription, but it's really just an extraordinary levy. This is the call-up of every single man in France who's able to bear arms aged 20 to 25. Older men and women are encouraged to do their patriotic duty with things like war production, with helping provision the armies. The elderly are meant to go into the town squares and encourage everyone with patriotic rhetoric. This is meant to be a national mobilization. And it really is an attempt to mobilize the country as a whole. But from a military point of view, the kind of conscription idea is that every man in this age bracket is called up for service. Now, theoretically, that's meant to bring in 1.3 million soldiers. In practice, they don't get anywhere near that. It's maybe 750,000, but it still is a huge influx of manpower, which fundamentally does the job and saves the revolution through 1793, allows them to go on the offensive in 1794 and push the enemies away from France's borders.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You talked about the levée en masse formed by young unmarried males. I'd like to talk about the 1798 Jourdan Law, which famously states, quote, any Frenchman is a soldier and owes himself to the defense of the nation, end quote. What was that law about, and how did it originate?
So, 1793 is the levy en masse, this raising of the whole country. And for the next 5 years, this huge army that they'd brought up in 1793, it's supplemented by some volunteers, by a few more men who kind of drift in, but really they rely on that mass of men. But by 1798, after 5 years of warfare, which is pretty much incessant, France is struggling again. The army's starting to look a bit thin through casualties, through losses, through desertion. And so the Council of 500, instructed by the Directory, this is the government at the time, they decide to look into how to start recruiting again for the army. And General Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, who will go on to become a marshal, of course, under Napoleon, he's a famous general of the time. He's got victories under his belt. He's now a member of the Council of 500. He makes some suggestions to the council, and they take well to them. And his suggestion is basically to follow the idea that with France as a republic, all men were citizens, and therefore all citizens owed their service to the nation. So, hence this line: every Frenchman is a soldier and owes himself to the defence of the nation. So this is their starting point. And if every man is going to need to kind of owe himself to the defence of the nation, they need a system to allow every man to do that service. And they kind of realized that actually, while in theory men should all want to defend the country, many of them might not. So therefore, they need a system which is kind of compulsory. They also recognized by this stage that just doing this in times of crisis isn't fair. So 1793, this cohort of men aged 20 to 25 was called up for service. And they were the only ones who'd had to defend the revolution, this single generation. So what Jourdan says is, well, that's unfair. Every other man needs to defend the country as well. We need a system to get them in. So what they suggest is basically to create an annual system of call-ups where a number of men chosen by the government will be called up every year to swell the ranks of the army, and they will serve 5 years and then they'll be discharged. And this, after a period of time, will lead to France being defended by a cross-section of its citizens. So this is the idea of this law. They bring it in September of 1798, and the stipulations are basically that Frenchmen are grouped into annual classes by age. So all 20-year-olds are in one class, all 21-year-olds, and so on. And each year, from the class of 20-year-olds, a number of men will be called up. That number to be determined by the government. If there's not enough men in the 20-year-olds, then they call up the 21-year-olds and the 22-year-olds and so on. But once you get past the age of 25, you no longer need to give service. So basically from September of 1798, what we have in France is an annual system of men being called up based on age, where you will serve for 5 years. The only change they make to that really is that the 5-year rule for being discharged disappears under Napoleon, and men continue to serve until they're killed or wounded. But that's basically the Jourdan Law. Comes in 1798 to ensure all men give service, but also basically to replenish the army that's been wiped out by 5 years of revolutionary warfare.
Yeah, and it goes on obviously until basically 1814, 1815, right? So that's 17 years of basically the Hunger Games where you're called out for duty and you may not come back.
Yeah, absolutely, and very much like Hunger Games, there's an element of selection in there as well. There is a ballot that takes place in public where you have men praying to whatever deity they pray to, that they're not the one that's going to be chosen. But as the empire goes on, as you can imagine, more and more and more men each year get chosen for service until by 1814, you've pretty much got no chance of getting away without serving.
Yeah. Well, it does accomplish the task of swelling the ranks of the French army and allows it to fight on a multitude of fronts. How does Napoleon hone this large army? And is he a proponent of mass conscription?
Yeah, so Napoleon, to start with, kind of takes it gently, and he only calls up a few men to begin with, and it's not much different to the Directory, really. He benefits from the fact that the Directory brings in this law a year or so before Napoleon takes power, and they immediately call up hundreds of thousands of soldiers to bolster the army. So when Napoleon comes in, he's already got an army that's been bolstered by conscription, so he can take things gently. So his first call-up, for example, in spring 1800 is only for 30,000 men. It's quite a modest number to call up. So initially he seems to like the idea of conscription, but not be going mad with it. Later, as you know, he starts to call up hundreds of thousands of men a year, and he's very much by that stage convinced by it. Napoleon does have more faith in what he would see as professional soldiers than conscripts to start with. He prefers his veterans. So when at the end of the Revolutionary Wars they start discharging veterans, Napoleon actually offers them the chance that conscripts can pay a veteran to stay in the army on their behalf. So, if you're chosen for conscription, instead of going yourself, you just pay a veteran to re-enlist for you. And he says he does this because he wants the army to be useful, not made up of men who are reluctant to be there, but instead made of hardened soldiers. So to start with, Napoleon clearly has some doubts about conscription, perhaps, but he pretty quickly loses those doubts and starts conscripting on a much wider scale, especially from about 1805.
Yeah, I see that it gives him three quick benefits. It's a quick reinforcement for his Army Corps. It gives him wider strategic reach as he holds more and more territory. And the morale, cohesion, like we talked earlier, being patriotic and promoting the nation's military endeavors. Yeah, I could see where it would benefit him, especially as the empire grows. The camp of Boulogne, though, does that allow him to train his army and these new conscripts, or is that pretty much just professionals up in the camp of Boulogne?
So the camp of Boulogne certainly allows him to train some of his conscripts. Any of them that were brought in pretty much before the summer of 1805 would be able to benefit from the camp there. So, the camp of Boulogne, as you know, is where Napoleon cantons his army ahead of this proposed invasion of England that never happens. And so for 2 years, from 1803 to 1805, the army is able to train, to build esprit de corps, and to integrate new conscripts into the veteran units. And this army from 1803 to 05 is a real mix of veterans from the early revolution, some conscripts from 1798 to 1802 who'd seen some action at the end of the Revolutionary Wars, and some new conscripts. So probably around 2/3 of the soldiers at the camp of Boulogne were conscripts, and half of those conscripts had never seen service before. So what this camp really allows is the integration of those into existing units. These units are led by experienced officers. They've got very experienced non-commissioned officers, and it allows a very highly tuned military machine to come in. And although the conscripts over the next 2 or 3 years, from 1805 to say 1808, don't benefit from this camp of Boulogne, what they do benefit from is moving into units that had this real cohesion, this real good leadership. And so the effects of that camp are felt 2 or 3 years down the line as well. It's not really till 1808, 1809, after mass losses and kind of changes in units, that the effects of that training are kind of lost. So the camp of Boulogne is a real benefit for Napoleon, even if at the time of that camp, probably only 2/3 of the army are conscripts, and only half of those conscripts hadn't seen much service before.
Yeah, how do they perform initially, these conscripts?
They're pretty good. As we mentioned, with the training time, it means that although they're conscripts, they're no less trained than regular soldiers. I've looked at a lot of samples of soldiers from different regiments, and these conscripts don't perform any differently in combat to anyone else. What is interesting, between 10 and 15% of conscripts, depending on the regiment, seem to have deserted. But the vast majority of those desertions, if you look at when men joined and when they deserted, the vast majority come in the first 6 months of their service. So by the time the conscripts get to the battlefield, they've kind of weeded out the 10% who really don't want to be there. The most reluctant ones have gone, and the ones who remain, they might not be fully enamored with the idea of being a soldier, but they are more motivated. And the results do kind of speak for themselves. Now, if we look at the army at Austerlitz, for example, by the day of the Battle of Austerlitz, 75% of the army are conscripts. But, they're winning this stunning victory. We look at Ulm, Austerlitz, Jena, Auerstedt, Friedland, 1805 to 7. These conscripts are doing pretty well. Now, sure, there are some checks along the way. Eylau, for example, but that's more a matter of kind of high command rather than the quality of the soldier. So I think the conscripts perform really well in the first few months.
It's interesting, yeah. Because I know Napoleon's enemies used conscription as well. You mentioned the landwehr earlier. How did they fare with conscription?
So they had slightly different versions of conscription. So, Austria, Prussia, Russia all have forms of compulsory service, but it's not the same kind of national system of calling up named men on a regular basis that France has necessarily. Often these systems are based on kind of regiments having different recruitment districts, being able to conscript there to fill their ranks using a quota system, more or less. Um, and often the states we're talking about there were also kind of patchwork administrations in the ancien regime style. So some districts, some provinces, towns have exemptions. So yeah, the enemies had compulsory service, but it wasn't quite the same as France. Having said that, the Austrian conscripts were no worse than any other soldier. Again, they were trained before they went into combat. They knew what they were doing. The only difference, I suppose, was the Landwehr, because the Landwehr in most German states is the equivalent of their militia. So reservists, their levies, they're given little training. Their officers are not the top class professionals, and they normally fight with courage, but without the kind of cohesion and maneuverability of other troops. So Landwehr often struggle a bit in the early part of the Napoleonic Wars. Probably much more effective in 1813 and afterwards, when actually the difference between Landwehr and regulars is somewhat less because of the lack of training of the conscripts in the regular army.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, if, let's say I'm a conscript in Napoleon's army, and I'm press ganged into the army. What is my life like? Am I getting paid? Do I have the same equipment as the regular army? Is my camp set up worse than the regular army? Like, what would my life be like?
Yeah, so in the French army, the life of the conscript is exactly the same as any other soldier because by the mid-Napoleonic Wars, pretty much the entire army is conscripts, or was at the start. So you have the same equipment, you work in the same units, the same rank structures, you have the same opportunity of promotion, which includes being promoted to officer rank. And quite a few conscripts were promoted to officer rank. That said, the life is tough. The French army is not a great place to be. There is pay, but it's low and it's always late. There's food, but it's bad and there's not enough. The accommodation's bad, the treatment's poor. And this is even in peacetime camps and depots. The bullying and violence are realities in the French army, daily realities. They are in all militaries at the time. There's something of a macho culture. But in the French army, discipline is a bit laxer. And, I get the sense it's not a nice place to be. Disease is also rampant in the French army. 1 in 5 conscripts die of disease during the
Mm-hmm.
Napoleonic Wars. And around half of them die in the first year of their service. Coming into new towns with all people from across the country, diseases they're not used to, etc. So life isn't great. Hardships would be alleviated for conscripts because they served with men from the same department, so maybe even from the same village or canton, and that could alleviate some of this hardship. But news from home is infrequent. Most men are illiterate, so they don't get news at all. But for all that, conscripts are folded into the regular army. They're there in every unit, and units, you know, bring them in like any other soldier. So they form part of this esprit de corps. They have companionship with their new comrades. A lot of these conscripts are also, I suppose, used to some kind of borderline poverty and privation. So maybe the hardship of the army isn't that bad compared to what they're used to in civilian life. So it's tough, but they are treated like other soldiers. To look at the conscript's journey just really, really briefly, what happens is they're balloted in their home department for service, and if they choose what they call a bad number, they have to go
Mm-hmm.
into the army. They're assigned a unit based on their height and based on their occupation, and then they're marched in a group to that unit. Once they arrive there, they get enrolled in the army. They're assigned a battalion, they're assigned a company, they're given a few weeks of training. And earlier in the Napoleonic Wars, this training, this assigning them the battalion and company, this allows them very much to be mingled with everyone else and integrated into these existing battalions. So they really do become part of the units. Now, later in the wars, so from 1808, 1809, as the army is increasingly forming new battalions or even new regiments with only a cadre of junior officers and non-commissioned officers to provide the experience, then conscripts are kind of concentrated into single units, which isn't ideal. But earlier in the wars, they are really folded into the the army. The equipment's also pretty good until after the Russian campaign. Equipment shortages, apart from for troops sent to Spain, equipment shortages normally aren't that much of a problem, but they become worse, as we go through the later wars.
Yeah, let's kind of talk about that. We're now past the heyday of the empire where things are going great. So we'll talk about kind of the decline of the empire. The 1808 loss of a French corps to the Spanish at the Battle of Bailen has been blamed on poorly trained and supplied conscripts. Is this accurate?
I think it's a really good example of new conscripts not being able to do what might be expected of veteran soldiers. Um, for me, the fault at Bailen is really from the overall strategy, and General Dupont really should take most of the blame. But the fact that his army is this kind of ragtag bunch of conscripts, and not just conscripts, but conscripts in provisional units and new units, so not ones that have been kind of folded into these existing veterans. But they're new battalions. There's a few foreign battalions in there as well. It means that when he comes to get surrounded at Bailen, his tactical options are pretty limited. He doesn't have an army that can maneuver and fight and fire as well as others. The conscripts also probably contribute to him getting surrounded. Conscript regiments couldn't march as fast. They're not as inured to hardship and privation. They couldn't forage as effectively. They didn't maneuver as well. They didn't have the same kind of confidence. Certainly in his kind of account of things, the number of stragglers and sick in his column was one of the reasons that he had to slow down and eventually get himself surrounded as well. So the conscripts certainly contribute to it. But I really blame Dupont. I think Dupont is a bad workman, and he's laying the fault at the feet of his conscripts. But this is kind of him blaming his tools. But nonetheless, yeah, Bailen does really show that untrained men in untried battalions are not really as effective as veteran soldiers, and there are drawbacks to using conscripts in these new units.
Yeah, we'll come back to that point shortly. By this time, you mentioned initially Napoleon was drafting 30,000 conscripts. That number went up to 60,000, and then quickly it's at 120,000 by 1810. So why this vast increase?
I suppose two things. It's attrition and it's overstretch. So the campaigns of 1805 to 7 have been pretty bloody affairs, but the losses in Spain from disease as much as enemy action really were also a major drain. And then the campaign against Austria in 1809 was much more costly than that of 1805 had been. So by the time we get to 1809, 1810, Napoleon's struggling for manpower pretty much. Looking back on it, we kind of expect this progression of different campaigns through the Napoleonic Wars. But at the time, it was unusual to fight with that kind of intensity, to fight so many major campaigns and major battles. And this army that Napoleon had in 1803 to 5 at the Camp of Boulogne, even bolstered by relatively modest annual conscriptions, was struggling to keep up with its numbers.
I think there's some other factors too. Like you're, in addition to losing conscripts, you're losing talented NCOs to casualties. You're losing generals like LaSalle and Saint Hilaire, and you're losing Marshal Lannes. So you're losing some top level folks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. He's losing his top level men. He's losing the rank below them as well, either getting promoted or being killed and wounded. So a lot of divisional and brigade commanders. And so by 1809, 1810, he's down to a B team pretty much of his divisional and brigade commanders. Some colonels have been promoted who are very good, but throughout the army they're struggling for good leadership. He's also, of course, got more things to lead. 1809 pretty much leaves Napoleon master of Western and Central Europe, which starts to stretch his forces even thinner. Sure, it does give him access to Allied troops, so the Duchy of Warsaw, Confederation of the Rhine, the Kingdom of Italy, but he needs more and more men to control this sprawling empire. So he's got over 250,000 men in Spain, and he knows he can't rely on some of the Allied troops there. So troops from Naples, for example, keep deserting in Spain, so he can't rely on them. So more and more of the men there have to be French. He has garrisons in Poland, in Prussia, in the German states. In 1810, he invades the Netherlands. Now, in the end, this is unopposed, but he didn't know that, and this had to be a full military operation. He's got garrisons in the Illyrian departments, the Hanseatic cities, and of course, from 1811, he's gathering an army to coerce Russia. So overall, he needs more and more men to control these areas that he's conquered. Especially as he has a deep fear that anything in Northern Europe near a coast, the British could just jump in some ships and descend on. So he needs to keep armies there. The Walcheren expedition of 1809, total failure from Britain's point of view. Humiliation, 16,000 men dead of disease to gain a swampy island for a couple of months. But for Napoleon, this showed that the British could just rock up on his coast wherever they fancied. So he needs to keep garrisons around that as well. So basically, he's short of men, and conscription is the way that he sees to bolster his ranks. Let's also not forget that the men who'd fought from 1805 to 1809, even if they hadn't been killed or wounded in battle, many of them are kind of broken by the experience, through illness, through exhaustion, through just the brutality of army life. And so from kind of 1808 to 1012, a lot of the veterans are being discharged from the army because they're just no longer physically able to keep up, and they need to be replaced as well. So, Napoleon's army is not in a good way, and this is why his conscription has to go up to such an extent from pretty much 1810 onwards.
Yeah. Well, it gets worse. After the disaster in Russia, Napoleon has to quickly cobble together an army in 1813. And these new troops are famously called Marie Louises because of their youth and, in reference to Napoleon's new wife, the Empress. How do these young folks do?
I'd say, pretty creditably in terms of courage, but they're definitely not the veterans of yesteryear that made the empire. I think in 1813, the army he's got is too large, too unwieldy, doesn't have enough horses, enough transport, doesn't have enough trained artillerymen or engineers. There's not enough experienced junior leadership. Unit cohesion just isn't there, and therefore it doesn't get the best out of these conscripts. But within the parameters of what they're being asked to do, the conscripts fight pretty well. The high casualty rates of this campaign in 1813 certainly show they're not shirking the action. And if we look at the major failings of the French army, it's as much due to high command as it is to what the conscripts are doing. There are some major kind of operational blunders by all parties in the French army through 1813. 1814, arguably, the conscripts do even better. The army is smaller, the sphere of operations is more constrained, and Napoleon's able to pull off this series of pretty impressive victories. He's got a few veteran troops, he's got his Imperial Guard, but most of the army is conscripts and National Guardsmen, and they're able to hold their own against the Allies pretty well. But I think, realistically, the Marie Louises, and they're called that because Marie Louise is the regent of France, and she's the one who issues the orders to call them up. These Marie Louises and their formations aren't up to much tactically. The generals are pretty much reduced to hurling their men at the enemy with the bayonet because they can't maneuver very well. They don't have much fire discipline. That's leaving aside the fact they don't have much ammunition. But there's courage, but brittleness, I think, in a lot of these units. I don't think Napoleon has any cause for complaint about their performance. They're semi-trained men. Often they're only 18-year-olds because they're calling up men a couple of years early. Others of them are in their mid-20s because they've been called up. They thought they were safe from conscription, and then the older classes of men have been recalled for service. So they're not old men, but men in their mid-20s who've settled down and thought they weren't going to fight would be less motivated, I guess. But many of these are kids fundamentally.
And I've read that, they're perfectly brave in battle and fought to the death, but it was just their sturdiness in like marching and carrying heavy packs all across Europe. They couldn't do it like the mid 20-year-old men that came before them.
Yeah, absolutely. Nowadays, you'd expect an 18-year-old to be pretty fully grown. But in France in the early 19th century, you weren't really fully grown until you were about 20, which is why conscription was set at 20 in the first place. 18-year-olds tended to be physically weaker, less able to withstand the rigors of campaign, to carry that heavy pack. And, it told on the army, this constant marching up and down. There's more stragglers, more men falling out, but there's no lack of courage at all from these conscripts, I don't think. It's clear that they are suffering from a lack of training and cohesion, although we should also say their enemies are too, of course. All the Allies have pretty much scratch forces at this time, which is why these campaigns are such brutal and bloody affairs. It's just two sides bludgeoning each other. But these French conscripts, they do their best, but they're fundamentally hamstrung by problems at the top of the army and simply by weight of numbers.
Well, according to sources, Napoleon, the duration of his empire, drafted 2.5 million conscripts from France and satellite countries like Italy and Germany, etc. And 1 million of these troops never returned due to casualties. So, did Napoleon's system of conscription work, do you think?
Um, it worked to the extent of giving Napoleon the manpower to embark on his conquests and his adventures. At no point does this system break down. So when the system's in place, it continues through the empire. And from about 1805, resistance and draft dodging as well are significantly worn down. So by the time we get to 1811, for example, only a negligible percentage of conscripts aren't showing up for service. It goes up again in 1813 after the Russian debacle, partly because it's older men being called up again, and partly because men have kind of heard what's happened in Russia and are more reluctant to serve. But the system really works in itself. Probably the most telling achievement, I guess, of this system is that by 1813, conscription is pretty much a rite of passage for young men. So when Napoleon issues these call-ups and it's about 1 million men that he tries to call up between late 1812 and 1814, the majority of them do show up. Now, there is more draft dodging, like I said, in 1813, 1814, but the majority show up, even in those older classes who thought themselves safe. So that in itself shows the system is working. Men are still showing up even for this forlorn cause. The system certainly does have its flaws. Not least, I suppose, in the perception that the rich could get out of it, while it's the rural poor who suffer the most. But if we look at the French population who didn't like conscription, there is really quite a good degree of buy-in from that population, though. They're not enthusiastic, but there's a kind of reluctant acceptance. So administratively, I think the system did work really well. I would say, though, that it is also a bit of an unwitting drawback for France. So knowing that he could simply replace soldiers with a stroke of a pen kind of might have made Napoleon a bit more blasé about losses, perhaps. And I do wonder, had he had to rely on just volunteers, just bounties, would he have had to become a more accomplished diplomat? Would he have had to be more of a circumspect general, more of a consensual leader of France?
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really great point.
So conscription works, but does it actually kind of enable his follies and enable his megalomania even in the later years of the empire? Possibly.
Well, yeah, I guess that leads me to my final question. Obviously, Napoleon has his downfall after Waterloo. So, what is the legacy of not only conscription today, but Jourdan's law, and some countries still have compulsory military service. So, what is the legacy, I guess, of this?
So, kind of in the immediate term, I suppose, the conscription works to basically make the French people more obedient to the central state. So, conscription is the blood tax. It is despised. And over 40% of conscripts die in service. Many others come home broken, or simply don't come home at all for different reasons, even if they're not dead. So this system isn't liked in any way, but it's part of a major change that occurs in France at the time. Because of the need for conscription, there's a bureaucratic machine created in France under Napoleon's empire that stretches from Paris down to every single town and village and hamlet in the country. So, every person in France is registered. They're all on lists somewhere in France. And it's because they needed to conscript that they created these lists pretty much. Now, these lists are held in the local town halls, in the department capitals, and in Paris. Prefects now know their department intimately because of their need to enforce conscription. Mayors are drawn into the state administration for various reasons, but conscription is the main thing that they were made to do. And all of that remains after Napoleon's gone. So this huge administrative bureaucratic machine and network remains in place, and it was mostly created to enforce conscription. So the role of conscription in France's history isn't just a military one. It does play this big role in the development of a central bureaucracy. I would say conscription is abolished in 1814 when the Bourbons come back. Napoleon doesn't bring it back in 1815 when he returns for the Waterloo campaign because he thinks it would be impolitic to do so. So the actual system is dismantled in 1814, but this bureaucracy isn't. More widely, a couple of legacies to mention, I suppose. Demographically, conscription is the thing that, takes 2.5 million Frenchmen away, and 1 million of them, as you mentioned, die. hundreds of thousands more were disabled for some reason or another. And if you look at France's population growth through the 19th century, it goes from 30 to 40 million people in the century before the First World War. So it grows by a third. So France has a massive demographic hit in the 19th century, when other countries are sprinting ahead in terms of population, and that's pretty much because of conscription. Economically as well, it leaves France struggling for manpower, especially manual labor. There's a couple of kind of more minor consequences. There's one bizarre one. So to avoid conscription, if you were 21 to 25, you could get married, and tens of thousands of men got married to, let's say, unsuitable brides, just to avoid conscription. So these might be women who are 50, 60, 70 years old, and the men marry them for form's sake just to avoid conscription. But of course, when the Bourbons come back, they outlaw divorce. So you end up with a load of these men married for 20 or 30 years to someone who they'd married from convenience, and neither party wants it, but they can't escape. It doesn't affect that many men, but that's an odd outcome. Slightly less negatively, I suppose, one legacy could be national unity. Men who'd been conscripted had served with others from across this varied nation. They'd been to different parts of the world. They'd seen other countries, and they'd come back to France. And they came back with stories of their travels, of course, but also stories of comrades, of friends from different departments and provinces, that maybe made them feel more of this national whole. But I suppose, in the cold light of day, conscription, it's unpopular. The service undertaken was pretty damaging to France. Conscription was abolished in 1815 or in 1814. It remains abolished in 1815. But in 1815, after Waterloo, the French army is more or less disbanded. So regiments are abolished. Men are sent to these newly formed departmental legions, which are meant to kind of break this link between the Bonapartist regime and the army. So the army is completely reformed. And when the Allied forces of occupation that arrive in France after Waterloo leave in 1818, the French government realizes that these legions are short of manpower. And so they decide the most effective way of recruiting was to reinstitute a system of annual conscription on a limited basis with a ballot, which would include some time in reserve formations. The man who brings us in was a Napoleonic marshal, Gouvion Saint-Cyr. Unsurprisingly, the system includes a lot of the parts of the Napoleonic system, the ballot, the way it's administered, very Napoleonic. So only 3 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, France reintroduces conscription. And that conscription remains in place as a permanent part of French army recruitment and indeed French society. Now, this is a rite of passage for every single young man, pretty much, with a couple of short interludes, but it remains in place until the final abolition of national service in France in 2001. So that Napoleonic system had a 3-year break, 1815 to 18, or 4 years, 1814 to 18, came back, and then, for almost 2 centuries, was part of every young man's life. And that in itself is a legacy of Napoleonic conscription.
Yeah, and like any government program, there's some unintended consequences and there's some unintended benefits. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Thank you for that, Graeme.
Oh, no problem at all.
Yeah, no, that was great. As always, I highly recommend Graeme's books. So you can find them on Amazon. And you can also find Graeme on X Twitter. Graeme Callister is his handle. Always great stuff on his Twitter and X page. And he's also a member, as am I, of the NRWGC charity. So please give that a look. And we thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.